Do you think that you're going to be a rock star?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I'm going to be famous rock star, yeah.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are here to talk about one of the most ridiculous moments in music, the hair metal or glam metal era of the 1980s. I'm sure you're probably all familiar, but just in case you aren't, I'm talking about bands that sound like this. And look like this, with the giant teased hair and the lipstick and the neon spandex. And just in case you were wondering, those are indeed all men. Hair metal has been the butt of the joke for decades, with movies like Airheads or bands like Steel Panther, kind of making fun of the stereotype of hair metal bands as these like pretty boys with giant hair, giant egos, and tiny little brains. And while all of that is honestly kind of true, at the same time, I also wonder, is there actually more to the story? I mean, there's a reason why those bands sold tens of millions of albums, right? And there's a reason why we continue to be so fascinated by hair metal, like you clicked on this video. So the question that I want to ask is it possible that hair metal was actually kind of great? Or on the other hand, is it trash like most people thought all along? I will do my best to answer those questions in this video. But first, if you haven't, please check me out on Twitch. I'm streaming twice a week from 4 to 7 p.m. Pacific on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and there's a link to that in the description of this video. And also, I want to thank Ritual for sponsoring this video. Let me ask you a question. Do you have a perfect diet day in and day out? Yeah, me neither. Who does, right? Well, that is where Ritual comes in. Ritual helps people fill the gaps in their diet with no shady additives, fillers, or colorants. These 2 easy-to-take capsules provide 10 nutrients to support a strong foundation for your health. And actually, they kind of smell good too. What I really like about Ritual is how transparent they are with the ingredients that they choose and why. You can see where they source all of it and even their environmental impact. This Essential for Men vitamin contains 10 high-quality nutrients like vitamin A, D, omega-3, and zinc that are difficult for men to get from their diet alone. They also have vitamins for men, a 50+ vitamin, prenatal, postnatal, and teen vitamins. And it's all delivered right to your door via a subscription. It works out to about $1 a day, no strings attached, and no additional charges. And they don't just offer vitamins either. They recently launched a new essential protein range as well. And Ritual are offering 20% off your first month by going to the link in the description of the video and using this code at checkout. First of all, let me take you on a quick trip down memory lane to kind of give you a recap of the history of this genre. Glam metal was at its peak in like the mid to late 80s, but the origins of the genre go back much earlier than that. As far back as like the early 70s, bands like T-Rex and David Bowie were laying the foundations for hair metal, but I think maybe more than anybody else, it was the New York Dolls.
I'm looking for a kiss. When won't you tell me why most kids are moving so slow?
Musically, all those bands pretty much picked up where Jimi Hendrix or Led Zeppelin left off, playing more or less like bluesy hard rock. But the main thing that they added was visual, with those campy theatrical performances and those wild androgynous outfits that look like something out of Rocky Horror Picture Show. Those bands laid the foundation, but hair metal really blew up in the 80s, centered around the Sunset Strip scene, which was home to legendary venues like the Whiskey, the Troubadour, the Roxy, and maybe most of all, the famous or maybe infamous Rainbow Bar and Grill, which is where you could find members of bands like Motorhead, Black Sabbath, and Alice Cooper just hanging out. And out of that scene, bands emerged like Ratt, Dokken, Quiet Riot, and probably most significantly, Motley Crue, who released their first album, Too Fast for Love, in 1981. And to me, this album and this incarnation of Motley Crue is really like New York Dolls 2.0. Musically, it was sort of this combination of hard rock, punk, and heavy metal. And they took the visuals to the next level as well, with the big feathered hair. You put all of that together and you had what people had started to call glam metal, because it was metal, but, you know, all glammed out. And you would be forgiven if you thought the guys in the band were female strippers who had just gotten off the stage at the Cat House, because they really took it there with the teased hair, the tight leather pants, and even the knee-high fuck me boots like Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman. But still, at least with the early hair metal bands, there was still something kind of raw and nasty to it. It was like the sound of a 3-day Sunset Strip bender where you pass out after too many shots of Jack Daniels, do a couple lines of coke to wake up, puke over your shoulder, and then start drinking again. I mean, you look at some of these bands, and as goofy as they might be, they were still gritty. Like, they looked like they smelled like some overflowing ashtray at the Rainbow, which they honestly probably did. At the heart of it, it was wild, dirty party music. Definitely not the kind of thing that you would want your kids to listen to, and honestly not entirely different from the punk bands of a few years earlier.
Playing power chords of debauchery and decadence.
Every excess you could possibly think of was not only available, but encouraged and accepted.
But that started to change with the second wave of hair metal bands in the mid to late 80s. The ones you've probably heard of, like Warrant, Cinderella, and Poison. And of course, there was also Guns N' Roses, but to me, they're kind of an exception. They were really more like the filthy, nasty dirtiness of the first wave of Sunset Strip bands. But putting them aside, in general, by this point, hair metal had really become like teeny bopper pop. Kind of like New Kids on the Block, but with spandex and guitars. A lot of people called this stuff pop metal at the time because the songs were very radio friendly, with almost none of that dangerous edge that a lot of the earlier 80s bands had.
You know that I can hardly wait.
Hair metal was obviously always a little bit over the top and corny, but in my opinion, this is where it really kind of jumped the shark. You look at their band pictures from that era, and they pretty much look like one of those glam rocker costumes that you would get at Spirit Halloween. And the liner notes for their first album almost read like a parody of the genre. For example, the album credits are CeCe DeVille, guitar screeching and hair bleaching, and Bret Michaels vocalizing and socializing. But with all of that being said, for as much as the quote-unquote real metal people hated all the glam stuff, these bands were doing big numbers. Poison had 3 back-to-back Billboard Top 10 albums. Motley Crue went 4 times platinum. Hair metal was as mainstream as it gets, right up there with pop artists like Madonna and Whitney Houston. And of course, anytime that something gets that big, everybody wants to jump on the bandwagon. One of my favorite things from that era is how a lot of hardcore punk and metal bands made the very strange decision to go glam. For example, Discharge, the founders of D-Beat, put out a glam album called Grave New World. And Celtic Frost, one of the pioneers of death metal, put out their own glam album called Cold Lake, which lives on in infamy. There was also Junkyard featuring Brian Baker of Minor Threat, Bad Religion, and Dag Nasty. And looking back on it, seeing bands like TSOL, Discharge, and Celtic Frost go glam was absolutely baffling, like one of those simulation is glitching kind of moments. But that's just how big hair metal was in the 80s. Everybody felt like they had to go with the trend or they'd be irrelevant. There were also literally thousands of generic copycat bands popping up all over the world, and the genre got taken to the point of just absolute absurdity. For example, Trickster, who were this kind of weird rednecky hair metal band who rode dirt bikes in their video. Or Jackal, whose hit song had a chainsaw solo. But maybe my personal favorite hair metal band was Nitro, who took everything about hair metal to just its absolute limit. They had the biggest hair, the highest vocals, the fastest solos. They even had a guitar with 4 necks. The genre had clearly gotten saturated and was about to collapse under its own weight.
Metal was all about groupies, excess, no political stance whatsoever. Just let's all have a real good time. And then the whole Seattle scene happened.
Which, as many of you probably know, is exactly what happened in 1991 when Nirvana released Nevermind. That album came out and it pretty much wiped out hair metal overnight, like when that big fiery comet came down and killed all the dinosaurs. And honestly, that was that for hair metal. And since then, it's pretty much only lived on in the form of the 80s bands who are still around, doing their thing, playing county fairs and casinos. And it's mostly thought of as this sort of amusing moment in pop culture, like, how did we let that happen? And yes, obviously this stuff was completely ridiculous and it's easy to focus on those aspects of it. But the truth is that there were also a lot of authentically brilliant, great things about hair metal. So let's get into exactly what those things are. First of all, these are some of the greatest rock songs of all time. Full stop. You can say what you want about the genre as a whole. You can and obviously should laugh at the hair and the outfits. Like, how could you not? But I think if you listen with an open mind, you have to admit that this is arguably the very best songwriting out of any era of metal. Take songs like Pour Some Sugar on Me by Def Leppard, Every Rose Has Its Thorn by Poison, Girls, Girls, Girls by Motley Crue, or Sweet Child of Mine by Guns N' Roses. You could play any of those songs today at a hockey game or whatever, and most of the people in the crowd are gonna at least know the chorus to those songs, whether they are 60 or 16 years old. That kind of truly timeless songwriting is incredibly rare. You really only get a few songs like that every year, and hair metal honestly has kind of a disproportionate share of them. And speaking of Guns N' Roses, I would put their first album, Appetite for Destruction, on the short list of the very best, most important rock and metal albums of all time. Honestly, it's right up there with Nirvana, Led Zeppelin, and the Beatles. It's that good. If you've never really listened to that album, like listened to it, you should. It's one of those albums where you really need to put on some headphones, sit down, give it your full attention, and really listen to the details. In particular, listen to the interplay between the guitars. What I think is really cool is how Slash and Izzy are almost never playing the same thing. Slash is in one channel, Izzy is in the other channel. The stuff that they're doing is incredibly nuanced and detailed, as much as any prog album. It's just a little bit more subtle, so I think most people have just never noticed it. And then there are the other hair metal songs that maybe aren't quite that iconic, but are still pretty damn good, like Twisted Sister, We're Not Gonna Take It, Skid Row, 18 in Life, or even like Cherry Pie by Warrant. And my personal favorite of the vast number of all those lesser known glam bands, Pretty Boy Floyd, who were admittedly corny as hell, but you know what? I love them anyway. And what made that hair metal songwriting so strong, in my opinion, is that it had a pop sensibility that's been almost completely missing from metal since then. Obviously, I'm not saying that all metal bands should go out there and try to be Pretty Boy Floyd, but I do think that a huge part of why metal has sort of steadily declined in popularity over the last 20 years is because bands lost sight of that pop sensibility. So much of metal now just kind of feels like this contest over who can be the most angsty and dark, and that certainly has its place. Don't get me wrong, but it kind of gets old after a while, right? Like there's only so much of that you can listen to. And as I have said before, the simple fact of the matter is that most people like fun. They don't want to be bummed out all the time. And that may seem obvious, but I think at the same time, the modern metal scene could use a reminder.
The most important thing you can learn from 80s metal is it doesn't have to be serious. It doesn't have to be complaining all the time. It can be a celebration.
But what about those crazy outfits? Obviously, it's easy to dunk on dudes wearing neon spandex and lipstick with cowboy boots and the giant teased up hair and all that because, I mean, come on, look at them. But at the same time, maybe there was something to that. I mean, it was entertaining, right? It caught your attention, and maybe there's something to be said for that. I mean, there's a reason why we are still fascinated by that look 35 years after the peak of hair metal. And again, I think that lesson is something that modern metal bands have forgotten. I mean, you look at most bands these days, and it's just 4 or 5 dudes in like normal clothes playing in their practice space or some abandoned warehouse. And it's no wonder that metal isn't cool anymore. Like I couldn't pick those guys out of a lineup if my life depended on it. And remember, this is the entertainment industry. And what is entertaining about 4 guys in black t-shirts rocking out in a warehouse? It's also worth mentioning that this was the last time that a lot of women were into metal. The fan base for this stuff was primarily teenage girls, which of course made all the quote unquote real metal people hate it, because the sad fact is that those type of people pretty much hate anything that young girls like. And that is definitely not good for the health of metal overall, because whether you like it or not, teenage girls, more than anyone else, are the people who determine what is cool and culturally relevant. So in a lot of ways, driving them out of metal was kind of the beginning of the end for the scene. Ask yourself this: is there any genre of music that's gotten popular without the support of teenage girls? And lastly, hair metal was very arguably the peak of metal musicianship. And yes, that includes all the modern progressive metal stuff. So am I saying that the hair metal bands were actually better musicians than Animals as Leaders and Polyphia? Actually, yes, I am. The guys in these hair metal bands were bad motherfuckers. One of my favorite examples of that is Winger, who you may remember as being the butt of the joke on Beavis and Butthead, but were actually incredible musicians. Listen to their song 17 and ignore the super creepy lyrics for a minute, which, yes, are about a high school girl. Obviously, that is totally gross and unacceptable, but put that aside for a minute and just listen to the music. In particular, how interesting the guitar phrasing is and the incredibly tight rhythm section. Not to mention the super shreddy guitar solo courtesy of Reb Beach. These guys were just legit as hell. There's no other way to put it. The drummer is Rod Morgenstein of the legendary prog band Dixie Dregs, and the bassist slash vocalist Kip Winger actually wrote a classical symphony a few years ago. And that is just one band. Like I said, the whole hair metal scene was full of these bad motherfuckers. There was also Mr. Big with Paul Gilbert and Billy Sheehan, Dokken with George Lynch, Richie Kotzen of Poison, and of course, Steve Vai and Slash, among many, many others. And that's not even getting into the whole like hair metal adjacent neoclassical shred scene, which was really the beginning of the modern guitar scene as we know it, with some just absolute monsters like Jason Becker. This is when he was like 17 years old. And it wasn't just the big guys, like even the relatively unknown hair metal bands could play very, very well. That was just the price of entry. As much as the genre was known for the ridiculous outfits and all the cringy lyrics, the truth is that the people in the bands were extremely serious about their musical skills. And most importantly, even though there were all these just monster shredders in the bands, they never lost sight of the songs. They never put flashy technique ahead of that. And so they never fell into the trap that so much of modern progressive metal falls into, where a lot of the music feels like it's just made by guitarists for other guitarists. And although there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, it really limits the audience. And again, I think that's a big factor in why metal has become so much less popular over the past 20 years. So in conclusion, was hair metal goofy, shallow, and sometimes just straight up dumb? Yes, absolutely, 100%. The guys in the bands kind of really did live up to that stereotype of having big hair, giant egos, and tiny brains. But at the same time, I think the genre deserves more respect than it gets. These were some genuinely brilliant musicians who wrote some all-time great songs and brought this sense of fun to metal that's kind of been missing ever since. So, I don't know. If you care about the future of metal, maybe it's time to put on some neon spandex, get a wig, and put on Poison's greatest hits. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. I also want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my podcasts early. There are members-only channels in my Discord that I'm super active in. I do giveaways, all kinds of other fun stuff, and there's a way to have me review your music. If you want me to check it out, all you need to do is join my Patreon at the $10 level or above. Then every month I do a call for submissions. If you want me to review it, just drop it in the comments of that post. Then I will review it live on Twitch and post it on Patreon for everyone else to see. So if that sounds cool to you, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.